The warning arrived at 6:17 in the morning. No press briefing, no diplomatic back channel, no courtesy call to the State Department, just 61 words, delivered through a direct communications channel, bypassing every institutional safeguard that professional diplomacy had spent decades building for exactly this kind of moment. 61 words that gave Canada 72 hours to dismantle a multilateral trade framework that 8 allied governments had spent 14 months constructing alongside it. 61 words that the administration believed would force Canada back to the bilateral negotiating table on American terms. And 61 words that would, within 51 hours and 43 minutes, produce a response so precise, so legally devastating, and so perfectly coordinated that trade lawyers across 6 capitals would later describe the hours that followed inside the administration as something one senior official privately called controlled panic. The administration thought it was issuing a warning. What it actually did was pull a trigger it did not know existed. For 22 months, the conflict between Washington and Ottawa had followed a recognizable pattern. The administration would apply pressure. Canada would respond. The cycle would escalate, stabilize, and then escalate again. Tariffs, financial restrictions, emergency declarations, deadline-driven ultimatums. The administration had deployed each instrument in sequence, and each time, the bilateral arena absorbed the impact. Canada absorbed it too. It responded, it pushed back, it activated emergency measures of its own, but it always responded within the same framework the administration had constructed. And as long as the dispute remained inside that framework, Washington held a structural advantage that no Canadian response could fully neutralize. Economic size, market weight, the sheer gravitational pull of American trade volume. Inside a bilateral arena, those advantages do not need to be argued. They simply exist. They shape every negotiation, every deadline, every ultimatum before a single word is spoken. The administration understood this. It had relied on it for 22 months. What it did not understand, what its internal modeling had never treated as a realistic scenario, was that Canada had spent those same 22 months preparing for the moment it would stop responding inside the bilateral arena altogether. The Resilience Trade Compact had not been built as a political solidarity arrangement. That was how Washington initially read it. Solidarity arrangements are common in international diplomacy. Governments sign them, issue coordinated statements of support, and occasionally coordinate retaliatory measures in response to external economic pressure. They look unified on paper. In practice, they are vulnerable. A sufficiently determined economic power can pull individual partners away through side agreements, preferential terms, or quiet bilateral negotiations that slowly unravel the appearance of unity. The administration had seen this pattern play out before. It had, in some cases, contributed to it. So when the Resilience Trade Compact took shape during the early months of the conflict, Washington filed it under a category it already knew how to handle. It was wrong. The compact was never a solidarity instrument. It was a legal instrument. More specifically, it was a coordinated trigger system, a mechanism designed to launch simultaneous, legally identical, and procedurally synchronized dispute filings under the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement framework, the moment a specific set of legal conditions were met. 8 governments had signed it. The United Kingdom, Australia, Japan, South Korea, Germany, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and Singapore. Each had reviewed the collective response mechanism. Each had stress-tested its legal foundation, each had approved the trigger criteria, and each had already decided, before the 61-word statement ever appeared, exactly how it would respond if those criteria were met. The statement met every one of them. The phrase the administration used, comprehensive economic isolation protocols, had never appeared in any previous trade document. Trade lawyers across 6 capitals searched for legal authority that matched it. None could find any. That absence was not a minor detail. It was legally significant. A threat issued, without clearly identifiable legal foundation, directed at a compact member, demanding suspension of a multilateral framework within a 72-hour window. That combination did not merely constitute aggressive trade posturing. Under the terms of the collective response mechanism, it constituted a qualifying trigger event. The compact had been designed for precisely this scenario. And within hours of the statement's appearance, all 8 allied governments had begun executing the response protocol they had rehearsed for nearly 2 years. What the administration believed was a bilateral ultimatum was, in legal terms, a notification sent simultaneously to 9 governments at once. Because Canada was no longer operating alone inside the bilateral arena. It had not been operating alone for months. Every provision of the Resilience Trade Compact, every clause of the collective response mechanism, every coordinated filing procedure had been constructed with a single strategic purpose: to ensure that any pressure applied to Canada above a defined legal threshold would automatically become pressure applied to 8 allied governments at the same time. The administration had aimed at one country. The architecture Canada had spent 14 months building meant the shot landed on 9. Understanding why this mattered requires understanding what the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement framework actually is and what it actually does. It is not a political forum. It is not a diplomatic table where the largest economy in the room sets the agenda. It is a binding arbitration system governing trade relations among all 166 WTO member states, a system the United States had helped create, had formally ratified, had relied upon in dozens of previous disputes, and could not walk away from without consequences. Its own trade experts had spent decades warning other countries to avoid. Inside this system, economic size carries no procedural advantage. A filing submitted by Singapore carries exactly the same legal weight as a filing submitted by the United States. The timeline is controlled not by the country applying pressure, but by the WTO's own procedural calendar. A schedule no government can accelerate, no government can halt, and no executive ultimatum can override. The administration had spent 22 months operating in an arena where American economic weight shaped every outcome before negotiations began. The WTO dispute settlement system was an arena where that weight counted for nothing, and Canada had just moved the entire confrontation there, with 8 allied governments standing beside it. 51 hours and 43 minutes after the 61-word statement appeared, Canada's trade minister stood before reporters at WTO headquarters in Geneva. The trade ministers of the United Kingdom, Australia, Japan, South Korea, Germany, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and Singapore stood beside her. 9 governments, 1 podium. WTO communications officials would later confirm it was the largest simultaneous ministerial presence ever assembled for a dispute filing in the organization's 30-year history. The Canadian Trade Minister spoke first. For 8 minutes, she outlined 8 coordinated dispute settlement cases, identical in legal foundation, synchronized in procedure, and addressing the full scope of 22 months of tariff escalation. Every word was precise. Every legal citation was exact. There was no ambiguity about the basis of the challenge, no opening for jurisdictional confusion, and no procedural vulnerability the administration could exploit in the early stages of review. When she finished, her British counterpart stepped forward and read a single paragraph confirming the United Kingdom's filing. Then came Australia, then Japan, then each of the remaining 5 governments, one by one, in the same order, delivering the same confirmation in the same measured tone. 8 statements, 8 filings, 8 governments, 1 podium. And when the final minister stepped back, Canada's trade minister returned to the microphone for a closing statement that had been drafted the previous evening, reviewed by legal teams from all 9 governments, and approved unanimously before the press conference began. She spoke 7 words on behalf of all 9 nations, 7 words that instantly rendered the administration's 72-hour ultimatum not expired, not defied, but legally irrelevant. We didn't counter-punch. We changed the arena. The administration had issued a deadline. Canada had replaced it with a process, and that process, the mandatory 60-day consultation period, then panel formation, then a review period lasting between 12 and 18 months, then an appellate phase extending another 6 to 12 months, meant that the 72-hour ultimatum had not simply passed. It had been absorbed into a legal timeline lasting a minimum of 27 months. A timeline the administration could not accelerate. A timeline it could not stop. A timeline it could not negotiate around through bilateral pressure because the bilateral arena was no longer where the dispute lived. The contest had moved. The rules had changed. And the instruments the administration had spent 22 months calibrating for a bilateral confrontation were now pointed at a framework they had never been designed to reach. So here is the question the administration's legal team was sitting with in the hours after Geneva. The question that one senior official's description of controlled panic makes impossible to ignore. If the jurisdictional challenge fails, and every independent trade lawyer who reviewed it publicly concluded it almost certainly would, what instrument does the administration reach for next? The jurisdictional challenge failed exactly as the trade lawyers had predicted, not slowly, not ambiguously, but with the kind of procedural clarity that leaves no room for reinterpretation. The WTO panel establishment phase proceeded on its normal schedule, indifferent to the challenge's existence, indifferent to the administration's characterization of the filings as a misuse of dispute procedures, and indifferent to every public statement the Office of the United States Trade Representative had issued in the 11 hours of silence between the Geneva press conference and Washington's first official response. The panel did not pause. The calendar did not adjust. The 27-month process did not wait for the administration to find its footing. It simply continued, the way institutional legal processes always continue, because they are not designed around the convenience of any single government, including the most economically powerful one in the room. The Office of the United States Trade Representative had been the administration's primary voice throughout 22 months of conflict. It had managed the tariff announcements, coordinated the emergency declarations, shaped the public framing of every major escalation, and maintained the consistent position that bilateral pressure would eventually produce the outcome Washington was seeking. For 22 months, that framing had held inside the domestic political conversation, even as its practical results grew harder to defend. After Geneva, The framing did not hold. The USTR's 11 hours of silence before its first response was not a strategic pause. It was the visible gap between an institution built to operate inside a bilateral framework and a situation that had moved entirely outside one. When the response finally arrived, characterizing coordinated WTO filings by 9 allied governments as a procedural misuse, the reaction from the international trade legal community was nearly uniform. It was not a legal argument. It was a communication strategy deployed in the absence of a legal argument. And the difference between those two things, in a proceeding governed by WTO rules, is the difference between a position that survives panel review and one that does not. Goldman Sachs published its client note within 48 hours of the Geneva filing. The note was precise in the way that financial institutions are precise when they are communicating risk to people whose decisions are measured in billions of dollars. It did not editorialize. It did not characterize the administration's response as inadequate or the compact's legal strategy as brilliant. It simply observed that WTO dispute proceedings had historically produced compliance outcomes in approximately 87% of cases where jurisdictional objections failed during the preliminary stages. It further noted that the jurisdictional challenge announced by the USTR appeared to have no successful precedent in circumstances comparable to those now before the panel, and it flagged, without elaboration, that the market implications of a 27-month procedural floor extending across 9 allied economies and the full scope of the American tariff regime were not yet fully reflected in existing trade forecasts. Morgan Stanley reached the same conclusion through a different analytical lens. Its bilateral risk revision extended the normalization timeline to a minimum of 27 months, and noted that the adjustment cascaded across its international equity research models in ways that would require weeks to fully recalibrate. Two of the most closely watched financial institutions in the world had just told their clients, in the measured language of institutional risk assessment, that the dispute was no longer operating on Washington's timeline. It was operating on Geneva's. The markets confirmed it before the analysts finished writing. On the day of the Geneva filing, the US dollar dropped 2.1% against a trade-weighted basket of currencies. That number is worth sitting with. A 2.1% single-day currency move driven by a trade filing is not a routine market fluctuation. It is a pricing event, a moment when the accumulated judgment of global currency markets recalibrates its assessment of an economy's near-term trajectory based on new information. The information the markets had received was this: the United States was now the respondent in 8 coordinated WTO dispute proceedings brought by 9 allied governments, covering 22 months of tariff escalation, under a legal framework with an 87% historical compliance rate and a procedural timeline no executive action could compress. The Canadian dollar climbed to its strongest level in 22 months. The Toronto Stock Exchange gained 1.9%. American equities moved in the opposite direction, with overall markets declining 2.3%, and sectors with significant trade exposure falling between 4.1% and 7.8%. The markets were not reacting to rhetoric. They were reacting to a structural shift in where the dispute now lived and what the rules of that new location meant for the next 27 months of economic planning across every sector, with meaningful cross-border exposure. Inside the United States, the political consequences arrived with a speed that reflected how thoroughly the Geneva filing had disrupted the existing domestic narrative around the conflict. For 22 months, the administration had maintained a relatively stable political foundation for its trade strategy, particularly within the Senate Republican caucus. Senators had raised concerns at various points, some publicly, most privately, but the overall posture had been one of measured deference. The administration framed the conflict as a necessary correction to trade imbalances that had accumulated over decades. It promised results. It argued that short-term economic friction was the unavoidable cost of long-term structural improvement. And for 22 months, enough senators had accepted that framing, or at least declined to publicly challenge it, to prevent the kind of legislative pushback that would have complicated the administration's freedom of action. Geneva ended that equilibrium, not because senators suddenly changed their views on trade policy, but because the Geneva filing had changed the factual landscape on which those views rested. The administration had not planned for this scenario. Its own modeling had never treated a coordinated nine-government WTO filing as a realistic outcome. That gap between what the administration had prepared for and what had actually happened was not a political abstraction. It was a concrete, publicly documented failure of strategic anticipation, and it landed in the middle of a Senate Republican caucus that had been absorbing the economic friction of the conflict for nearly 2 years, on the promise that the strategy was working. The senator from Ohio did not soften his assessment. He stated publicly that describing the WTO filing as a misuse of procedure lacked credibility for anyone with functional knowledge of the organization's dispute settlement framework. 8 allied governments had every legal right to use the mechanism they had used. Calling that mechanism illegitimate, he argued, was not a defensible legal position. It was an admission, delivered in the language of legal objection, that no meaningful legal response existed. The senator from Michigan focused on the timeline. Manufacturers in his state had been told for nearly 2 years that the trade strategy would deliver results before it delivered damage. The Geneva filing had reset every assumption embedded in that promise. The dispute was no longer moving on political deadlines that the administration could control, accelerate, or reframe through communication strategy. It was moving on a legal process expected to last at minimum 27 months, with outcomes determined by WTO panel rulings rather than bilateral negotiating leverage. If any meaningful resolution emerged from that process, it would arrive after 2 additional congressional election cycles had already passed. The political math embedded in that observation was not complicated, and every senator in the caucus understood it without being told. Within 72 hours of the Geneva filing, 3 Republican senators introduced legislation requiring congressional review before the administration could pursue challenges to WTO dispute settlement jurisdiction. The proposal was significant not primarily as a legislative instrument, though its procedural implications were substantial, but as a signal. Senate tolerance for unilateral executive trade actions had reached a point that the Geneva filing made impossible to continue ignoring. The legislation said, in institutional language, what the senators from Ohio and Michigan had said in plain language.